The sheds at Arran in the Pas-de-Calais stood in long, silent rows, and inside them sat something Britain had never openly admitted to building in such numbers. Hundreds of Mark V tanks, their engines cold, their sponsons streaked with mud from the final advances of the 100 days. When the armistice took effect at 11 o'clock on 11th November 1918, the great mechanized gamble of the war suddenly had no war left to fight. Crews, who had spent months learning to coax these lumbering steel hulls across shattered ground, now faced a stranger question. What on earth was to be done with them all? Britain had built the Mark V in extraordinary haste during 1918, and by the armistice around 400 had reached France, supplemented by hundreds more still in workshops or awaiting shipment from Britain. Across the whole Mark series, several thousand tanks of varying marks had been produced since 1916, but the Mark V represented the most refined expression of that lineage, fitted with the new Wilson epicyclic steering system that finally allowed a single driver to maneuver the vehicle without three other men wrestling secondary gears. It was faster, more reliable, and considerably less exhausting to crew than its predecessors. Whilst German engineers had produced barely 20 A-7V tanks in the entire war, Britain's industrial base had turned tank production into something approaching a proper program, and that imbalance would shape everything that followed. The question was no longer whether tanks worked. It was what a peacetime army and a watching world ought to do with several hundred of them now that the shooting had stopped. The scale of what existed at war's end was considerable. Tank Corps records suggest that by November 1918, something in the order of 2,000 tanks of all marks had passed through French depots since the weapon's debut at Fleur-Courcelette in September 1916, though attrition, mechanical failure, and battlefield losses had thinned that number substantially. Of the Mark V specifically, perhaps 600 had been built by the armistice, with production continuing briefly afterwards before contracts were cancelled. Depots at Arran, at Tanneur, and at the great tank training and repair establishment at Wylie held the bulk of the surviving vehicles, alongside training grounds back in Britain at Bovington Camp in Dorset, which had served as the Tank Corps' spiritual home since 1916. Conditions varied enormously. Some tanks were mechanically sound and freshly overhauled. Others were battle-scarred wrecks, their engines seized, their tracks thrown, awaiting cannibalization for spares. A number had simply been abandoned where they broke down during the final advances through Picardy and the Hindenburg Line sectors, too costly to recover in the war's closing weeks. Unlike the German fleet at Scapa or the Zeppelin sheds the Allies would soon inspect, there was no question of surrender here. These were British machines, and the immediate debate was purely domestic and inter-allied. Should the tank arm be preserved as a permanent feature of the post-war army, scaled back dramatically, or dispersed abroad to allies and prospective allies who had watched the weapon's effectiveness with considerable interest? The War Office, mindful of tightening peacetime budgets, leaned toward drastic reduction. Yet officers within the fledgling Tank Corps, several of whom would become influential interwar theorists, argued fiercely that the machine had proven itself indispensable and that scrapping the fleet wholesale would squander 4 years of hard-won expertise. That tension between economy and doctrine would define the tank's fate for much of the next decade. Britain's own handling of the Mark V fleet reflected this uncertainty. The War Office initially retained several hundred vehicles for training and experimental purposes, concentrating much of this activity at Bovington, where the Tank Corps' central workshops and later the Tank Museum's predecessor establishments began accumulating examples for study, driver instruction, and mechanical research. Trials continued through 1919 and into the early 1920s, testing improved suspension, alternative armament layouts, and the durability of the Ricardo engine under sustained peacetime use rather than combat stress. Vickers, which had been deeply involved in tank development throughout the war, drew on Mark V experience when developing the Vickers medium tank during the 1920s, a lineage that connected the lumbering rhomboid shape of the Great War tank to the faster, more maneuverable designs that would follow. France, Britain's principal partner in tank development, took a rather different approach, shaped by its own substantial Renault FT program. French forces had operated small numbers of British tanks during collaborative operations, and French officers inspected Mark V examples at Allied technical conferences held in Paris and Versailles during 1919, comparing heavy British designs against the lighter, revolving turret Renault FT that France had championed. French assessments generally concluded that Britain's heavier philosophy suited breakthrough operations against fortified positions, whilst the FT's mobility suited exploitation, a distinction that would echo through interwar doctrine on both sides of the Channel. France did not retain significant numbers of Mark V tanks itself, having its own extensive FT fleet, but French observers' reports fed directly into ongoing debates about mechanized warfare that would occupy general staffs throughout the 1920s. The United States, a comparative latecomer to tank warfare, took perhaps the keenest interest of any Allied power in studying the Mark V in detail. American tank crews had trained on and operated British-supplied Mark V and Mark IV Star tanks during 1918, most notably the 301st Tank Battalion, which fought alongside British forces during the assault on the Hindenburg Line near Bellicourt in September 1918. Following the armistice, the United States shipped a number of Mark V tanks back across the Atlantic for evaluation at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland and at Camp Meade, where the fledgling American Tank Corps, under officers, including a young George S. Patton, conducted detailed technical and doctrinal assessments. American engineers examined the Wilson steering system closely, and lessons drawn from operating captured Mark V hulls alongside domestically produced Renault-derived designs informed the small, underfunded American tank program of the interwar years. Budget constraints in Washington limited how far this technical interest translated into new production. But the intellectual groundwork laid at Aberdeen and Meade would resurface once American armored doctrine accelerated in the following decade. If you're finding this look into what happened after the guns fell silent interesting, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the aftermath of the Great War. Beyond the three principal powers, Mark V tanks found their way into rather more unexpected hands. Poland, fighting for its independence and then against Soviet forces in 1919 and 1920, received a substantial consignment of British tanks, including around 120 Renault FTs from France and a smaller number of British machines supplied as part of Allied efforts to bolster the new Polish state. White Russian forces under General Denikin in southern Russia also received British tanks, including examples of the Mark V, as part of British intervention against the Bolsheviks during 1919, shipped through Novorossiysk and employed with mixed success against Red Army units unfamiliar with armored warfare. Estonia likewise received a handful of British tanks during its War of Independence. These transfers scattered examples of the design across Eastern Europe in circumstances far removed from the orderly evaluation programs underway at Bovington or Aberdeen. For the great majority of the fleet, however, peacetime brought disposal rather than distinguished service. The inter-allied bodies overseeing German disarmament under the Treaty of Versailles, signed on 28 June 1919, had no jurisdiction over British equipment, but Britain's own treasury exerted comparable pressure through sheer fiscal necessity. Post-war Britain faced enormous debts, and the Ministry of Munitions moved quickly to liquidate surplus war material of every description. Hundreds of tanks in France were simply scrapped where they stood, their steel plate sold for its metal value amid a depressed post-war market that made even scrap prices disappointing. Depots at Arran and Tanneur became vast breaking yards through 1919 and 1920, acetylene torches reducing rhomboid hulls to manageable sections for transport to smelters. Some tanks, considered unsafe or simply surplus to any conceivable requirement, were used for demolition and gunnery practice on ranges in France and at home, deliberately destroyed to test the effectiveness of anti-tank weaponry then under development. Estimates suggest that of the several hundred Mark V tanks that existed at the armistice, perhaps fewer than 20 survived the scrapping programs of the early 1920s in any recognizable form, a survival rate under 5%. The economics were unforgiving. Steel was needed for reconstruction, army budgets were slashed year on year through the early 1920s, and a weapon system many politicians regarded as an expensive wartime expedient held little appeal against the urgent priorities of a nation rebuilding itself. What did survive did so largely through deliberate institutional choice rather than accident. Bovington Camp retained a core collection precisely because the Tank Corps, keen to preserve its own institutional memory, argued successfully for a small number of historically significant vehicles to be set aside from the general scrapping. This nucleus eventually formed the foundation of what became the Tank Museum at Bovington, which today holds several Mark V and Mark V Star tanks, including examples that saw genuine combat service, making it the most important collection of Great War armor anywhere in the world. A Mark V also survives in Australia at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, a presentation tank awarded in recognition of Australian forces' contribution to tank operations during 1918. Poland's wartime acquisitions left at least one surviving example, whilst isolated hulks recovered from former battlefields and training grounds have occasionally surfaced decades later, rusted relics pulled from farmland or former ranges and, where possible, painstakingly conserved. Restoration of these survivors is notoriously difficult. Original Ricardo engines are all but unobtainable, correct armor plate specifications are hard to source, and decades of corrosion typically require extensive fabrication of replacement components, work that specialist teams at Bovington have undertaken with considerable care over the decades. One particularly celebrated case involved a Mark V recovered from a former Eastern European battlefield decades after the fighting ended, its hull half buried and reclaimed by farmland, requiring years of patient conservation before it could be safely displayed. Elsewhere, wreck fragments have occasionally surfaced in France during agricultural work or construction. Reminders that not every scrapped or abandoned hull was fully accounted for at the time, and that the story of what survived is still, in small ways, being written today. The legacy of the Mark V extended well beyond the handful of steel survivors in museum halls. Its steering innovations fed directly into Vickers' interwar medium tank designs, whilst the operational lessons drawn by American officers at Aberdeen and Camp Meade planted seeds that would germinate slowly into the mechanized doctrine the United States eventually deployed in the Second World War. British theorists, who had served with the Tank Corps, wrestling in the 1920s with a shrinking budget and institutional skepticism, kept alive ideas about concentrated armored formations that would later influence doctrine across Europe, for better and for worse, as other nations studied the same lessons with considerably greater enthusiasm and resource. There is a certain irony in a machine so thoroughly scrapped exerting such disproportionate influence on the following 2 decades of military thinking, but the handful of surviving holes at Bovington stand today as tangible evidence of a technology that was, in its moment, revolutionary, and in its disposal, almost entirely erased. The sheds at Arran fell silent for a second time once the braking crews finished their work. The last hulls loaded for the smelters by the early 1920s, and within a few short years, the fleet that had helped break the Hindenburg Line existed mostly as scrap metal and fading photographs. What remains today, whether in Bovington's galleries or Canberra's halls, represents a startlingly small fraction of what once rumbled across the Western Front. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to Germany's captured A-7V tanks after World War I next. It explores how the Allies raced to secure the handful of German tanks that survived the armistice, and what became of the technology Germany never managed to produce in numbers. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching.